What's the answer to this? I mean, how many kids, in quotations, do people need to start having?
Well, first of all, replacement level is 2 to 3, a little over 2. If kids are going to make it, as the vast majority, thank goodness, now do, then a couple of kids is enough. 2 to 3, there'll be people who won't want any. The question then is, how do we get there? There are things government can do, but I think throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. We need a cultural change. We need a shift. So that whatever the cost of housing, whatever the cost of childcare, whatever the government support levels, at any given level, people want more children than they're having. It's got to be about models of people who are successful and use their success not to just lead a hedonistic life, but to have a family.
All right, welcome back to the Better Human podcast. Like usual, we always have amazing guests. And today we have Dr. Paul Morland, who is an author and a broadcaster who writes and speaks about population and the big demographic trends across the world, both contemporary and historic. Paul's actually written 4 books, his latest book being called No One Left, which we're going to actually chat a little bit about today. And of course has been interviewed in the world's leading newspapers, magazines, just a complete expert when it comes down to demographic and population. He is also from the UK. He's actually currently in France today. And as we were wrapping a little bit before the show, we started to record. He was telling me that he's got a little bit of a scratchy voice today, which I made a joke around. Well, this is what we call a radio voice, which is right up your alley and it's right from the industry. So we should be good. In Paul's
maybe it's a radio face as well, Greg.
Maybe that's actually the term, right? But in Paul's latest book, he argues that there is a population calamity unfolding before our eyes. And unless we radically change our attitudes towards parenthood and embrace a new progressive pronatalism, we face disaster. And of course, I asked him, what does pronatalism mean? Which is really sort of the motivation to start having more kids, which we'll get into, which sounds like a little bit of a simple topic, but actually it's quite deep. He talks a little bit about it in his book where it looks at things like labor shortages, pension crises, ballooning debt. Kind of feels like the world that we're in right now. It's almost like this is happening, what's currently going on in South Korea, and which faces population's decline of more than 85% within the 2 generations, threatens to engulf us all. And the sooner we think about it and the sooner we start to take action, the better. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hello.
How's your voice? How's the throat?
Better than it was, but not as good as it will be.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, man, you are, we were chatting a little bit about before the show, and, it's actually scary in if you look at the world today, the position that we're in. And I think, one of the things that I've always been motivated to do is, be a critical thinker, but also have insights and clarity to what's going on so one can make decisions. So why don't we just kind of kick off with the top line stuff, which is kind of, what's going on in the world, and tell us a little bit about the book.
Okay, so the book argues that we're heading for a big human calamity as societies age and shrink. And it sort of surveys that around the world. It used to be a rich country thing, used to be a European thing. It's increasingly a global thing. So now quite poor countries like Jamaica and Thailand are heading for the rocks demographically. And what basically happens is we all started off in pre-modern times, which really means, say, before 1750. We all had big families. There was little control of fertility. Loads of kids died before the age of 1. And the population edged forward, edged backwards. It was very slow growth. Then we got better at staying alive. Mortality collapsed first in America and Britain, and then around the rest of Europe, and then around the rest of the world. And for a period, you've got falling mortality, and you still have big families. And the population continues to grow and actually grows very rapidly at that point. And eventually, family size comes down and the population stabilizes. The problem now is that we are undershooting the number of children we should have in country after country. In places like the UK, Germany, Russia, we haven't had a high enough fertility rate to replace ourselves for 50 years. that in the States, it's been a bit too low, but it's now come dramatically down. As I was saying, in quite poor countries, which previously had lots of kids, they're having
which is
well below
unusual.
2.
You would think, as the examples you use, Jamaica and Thailand, right? There is a cultural sort of known thing, which is, you have lots of kids. So the fact that those types of countries are not having kids is crazy. I mean, you might look at more of the modern sort of countries, as you said, UK, US, Canada, where it might be happening more. But let me ask you the
Greg,
first
let
question.
me give you an example there that will be interesting for your US listeners. If you take the US territories and states, you'd expect, actually, your Montanas, your Dakotas have got a higher fertility rate. Your northeastern New Englands, Vermonts, and so on have got a lower one. The lowest is actually Puerto Rico. Now, I quote in one of my earlier books that famous line, which may be known to some of your listeners from West Side Story: Puerto Rico, you lovely island, always the money owing, always the population growing. Well, that was the world in the 50s. If you were a poor part of America or poor part of anywhere, you were having big families. So Puerto Rico has actually got the lowest fertility rate of any US state or region. And you wouldn't expect that given the relative poverty of Puerto Rico. Obviously, it's richer than it was, but it's still one of the poorest parts of the US if it were strictly part of the US. And yet people are having fewer children than in any other part of the United States. So that relationship between, on the one hand, development, modernity, prosperity, and on the other hand, family size has kind of broken down, and everyone's having small families.
So why do you think this is happening? And then obviously I want to lead into sort of how is this going to contribute to the collapse of society or the human beings on Earth, right? But why do you think this is happening?
It's a bit of a mystery in a way. I mean, whatever you come up with as an answer, there seems to be a counterexample. So in Britain, for example, people say, oh, it's because the housing's expensive. But actually, if you go to parts of the UK where housing's cheap, or if you go to countries in Southeast Europe like Bulgaria or parts of Germany where housing is cheap, you find the fertility rate is still very low. Again, we say, oh, it's because there's very expensive childcare. But again, if you go to parts of the world, parts of Europe where childcare is very highly subsidized, again, like Germany, we still find that the fertility rate's low. It seems to be something profound in the modern condition that in the past, when people were in their 20s, say, getting on with some form of coupling up, whether it was marriage or not, and having children was seen as the normal thing to do. And that's just ceased to be the case. And people are putting it off and going through their 30s and getting to the point where it's too late.
I mean, you were talking a little bit about in previous generations. Yes, in your 20s, the whole sort of joke or the focus was, grow up, get a house, get a partner, have 3.2 kids, white picket fence, and move on. And we're seeing in today's world, maybe sort of that younger generation, there's been like that whole conversation of delay to launch, right? Which is, things are just taking longer in life to launch with. But then you see certain states, we talked about the US before, where you're like things like Montana, right? Actually, my buddy lives in Montana, and, I have this conversation with him all the time, which is, their motivation to operate in a community and to have kids and to sort of have more of a traditional life and stuff like that. So, but again, as we were talking about before, for every argument or for every argument for why this is happening, there's a counter argument. I think simply put, we are seeing, and we were chatting about this before, which is, I don't think the pandemic helped over the last few years. I think in some cases it's kicked us back in our connection with human beings even further, right? We were talking a little bit about how, people have sort of lost their motivation to socially connect, right? And it's simple things like people don't want to go in the office anymore, right? Like you start to walk these things back. don't want to go in the office, don't really feel like going out to socialize with people, not really investing in relationships, not really traveling and sort of, getting out there anymore. It's become okay to sort of stay at home. Then there's this whole digital world where like people are stuck to their screens, right? And you're seeing young males today are, in quotations, not interested in intimacy and sexual connection and dating and stuff like that. And, the ability to watch porn, not the ability, like the watching the porn, the digital AI girlfriend, right? That is everything for you. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, we're seeing, in a lot of cases, there's the odds are against, call it the younger generation right now. Would you agree with that?
I think all those trends are working in the wrong direction. On the other hand, these are quite long-standing tendencies. So I think we go back before the pandemic and fertility rates were too low. I mean, they went below replacement, as I said, in most of Europe in the early 70s. So the trends that you've talked about have exacerbated the situation, but they haven't actually created it in the first place. It was already there and it was already getting worse. And if you look at countries, say, for example, pornography, it's a classic case. It must be all about porn. Well, if you go to South Korea, I've been to South Korea. I haven't searched for porn in South Korea, but apparently it's banned in South Korea. And I don't know whether there are ways around it I've no idea. But South Korea's got the lowest fertility rate in the world. So I think it's somehow very profound. And if we want to understand what's really going on, the best thing is to look at the exceptions. So one of the things I do in the book is take some time to look at where the trend is being bucked, as it were. So one thing we know is, and I think Americans will relate to this, but it goes beyond the States. There's a very clear link between religion and fertility rate, but only what we call the Abrahamic religion. So only Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. If you actually look at Hinduism and Buddhism, there's no evidence that being more religious leads to larger families. But there's a very strong correlation in many countries where it's been studied between religiosity and fertility rates. Spain, France, Britain, America, where people are more religious, declare themselves more religious, or are more likely to attend religious services, they definitely have a higher fertility rate. And so in the US, one of the things we've seen is a drift away from religion. And the religious are still having larger families, but there aren't so many of them. So that's one thing. Political attitudes in many countries, again, the data here is less good than for religion, but more what we might call right-wing nationalistic type people are likely to have larger families. And there's been studies in the States of very Trumpish counties and very Bidenish counties, and they have much higher fertility rate in the Trumpish counties. The only country in the developed world, the only rich, educated, urbanized country where people have above replacement fertility is Israel. Now, there also, it's very closely related to religiosity, but even the secular people have a couple of kids. The average is about 3, which for a really wealthy, really urbanized, really educated country is quite exceptional. And in the case of Israel, it's a very strong pronatal culture. But I think at root, and this is anecdotal, this is impressionistic, I think at root is that sense of being surrounded by people who want to finish you off, a sense of vulnerability and a sense of collective identity that has actually fueled a culture in which having children is the most valuable thing you can do.
Well, there's those wise old sayings, right? And one of them is have kids. It's one of the most important things you can do in life, right? Look, I didn't want to have kids when I was younger. When I was in my 20s, like there was no thought about having kids. I had my kids in my mid 30s. I shouldn't say I had my kids. We had our kids.
How old was your wife at the time?
My wife, she's 10 years younger. So I think we got pregnant. It must have been 30. I was 35, 36. So she was 25, 26. And of course, I mean, it completely changes your perspective. And, I think it's call it your biological responsibility in some capacity. But let me ask you this. How does this now, it might sound like a silly question, but how does the lack of having kids going to contribute to the decline of the human race?
Well, I'm glad you say the human race, because I've been banging this drum for some time, and I get very mixed reactions, including people saying it's racist, which of course is nonsense, because as I always say, that's a very outdated view of the world. When this was just a problem for white people of European extraction, people banging on about it had every right to bang on about it, but it was harder to push back on the claim that it was racist. Today, it genuinely is a human problem.
Yeah, specifically for the examples you were talking about, right? Around the world.
Yeah, and in America, for example, a big part of the fall in the fertility rate has been the fall in non-white fertility. So there was a time when African Americans, and particularly Latinos, had a high fertility rate. Unsurprisingly, people coming from Mexico, it was a high fertility country that just arrived. Two things happened. First of all, Mexicans in the States started to conform to the norms of the rest of the country, which happens with immigrants everywhere. Secondly, back in Mexico now, the fertility rate's hardly higher than in the United States. So this is a human race problem. It's not the problem of one particular race. In terms of what the problem looks like, I mean, first of all, I think there are multiple human tragedies. I have at least practiced what I preach. I've got 3 kids. I've got 2 grandchildren with another one on the way. So fortunately, my children are practicing the same values that I have of their own free will. That's their choices. But if we don't have enough children individually, if we miss out, I think you're missing out on the greatest adventure of life and the most wonderful and exciting thing. I'm here in France alone with my wife, but we just said goodbye to my son and his fiancée, my oldest daughter and her husband and their baby. And it was just wonderful spending time with a baby. He's almost a toddler now. So it doesn't get into the data, but there's just an awful lot of missed opportunities at the richest, most exciting, most life-enhancing thing you can do. So that I have to put front and center, even though it doesn't kind of get captured in the social science or the economics. Looking beyond that, what's the problem at a social level? Well, the problem is we age. And the generation that is supposed to be looking after for us, paying our pensions, running the economy and doing the care of older people is shrinking. Now, one way of coping with that is to bring people in from other countries. The problem with that is, first of all, that creates very rapid ethnic change, which not everybody wants. Secondly, we're drawing on a pool of people who won't always be there. So, for example, in Britain, we normally got mass immigration from Ireland, where they had very high birth rates, poor country, and Poland, high birth rates, poor country. Those are not poor countries anymore. They're both quite prosperous. Ireland has a higher per capita GDP than Britain. So we're having to bring immigrants in from lower and lower productivity places, the last places where they do have high fertility. That tends to be countries that are much more culturally different from us, people who are much harder to integrate, people whose economic contribution is going to be much more limited. And I also think it's immoral to be recruiting, say, from Ghana, thousands and thousands of qualified medical staff when they need them more in Ghana than they do in the UK. So it's a very lazy attitude to say we're too busy, too important to have our own kids. We'll ship them in from somewhere else. And there are fewer and fewer places we can ship them in from. So in very concrete terms, what does it mean? Well, forgive me, I'm going to talk about the UK again, but it's very common in Europe. We've got very sluggish economic growth, but we still can't fill all our employment requirements. We have mass immigration. We still can't fill our employment requirements. When I joined the workplace, there were almost 2 young 20-somethings joining for every 60-something leaving. And now it's closer to 1 for 1. Go to Japan, where they're at the most advanced level in this. Their fertility is not as low now as it is in Korea, but they've had very low fertility for a long time. Their government debt is twice the level of US or British. The economy lacks any kind of dynamism. There's a lack of young, inventive people. The number of patents has gone down. The creativity of industry has gone down. And Japan is facing a fiscal cliff. And the Prime Minister of Japan has talked about societal collapse. It's almost impossible to imagine a society like Japan rediscovering its vitality and recovering without that rediscovering of vitality having a demographic element. In other words, if Japan continues on its current track, and the rest of us do, we will grow old, we will grow unimaginative, we will shrink in on ourselves, we will have more and more debt, and we will see the kind of decline more and more globally that we've been seeing certainly in Europe and to an extent in North America over the last decade or two.
Yeah, you just answered that for me, which is without a younger population coming in, you don't have growth, right? And from a business economic standpoint, that's, as you were talking about, like starting businesses, taking on roles, inventing things, patents, like, that's in quotations where they say it's a young man's game, right? Which is that,
of course,
inventive, imaginative, risk taking. So, and maybe you can't fully answer this, but how long? Like, what's the timeline for all of this?
Well, first of all, the future's here already. So we're already seeing that lack of dynamism, that lack of productive growth. We're seeing mounting government debt. In the US, you can model your social security and you can see when it goes bust. But it's not as suddenly we wake up one morning. We're already feeling negative effects of this. We already got sluggish growth, mass immigration, ethnic change, and a backlash against that ethnic change. It's only going to get worse. But when it really hits seriously, it's going to vary by country. So we and the Japanese both hit below replacement fertility at the same time. But in the States and in Britain, it was only a bit below replacement for a long time. And in Japan, it came well down in the 70s and 80s. So their problem is more severe. And I don't know when, for example, the debt markets say, we're not interested in Japanese debt. We don't believe the government will ever repay it at 250% of GDP versus, say, 100% for the US or the UK. There will come a point, one manifestation will be where there's a crisis in the debt markets. And when we had the crisis in 2008, it was very much about these financial institutions were losing their credit, their credibility, and the government needed to come in, but the government had credibility, and that just about saved the system, as it did in the 1930s. When the credibility of the government goes, because the population it's taxing is shrinking, because its promises on pensions are so great, when that goes, the last dam, if you like, breaks, and there's nothing to save the financial system. So that's just one way in which this crisis will manifest itself, probably in Japan before elsewhere. But we're only further down the line.
Yeah. In Canada, it's been known for a long time. Like, you pay your CPP, which is your Canadian pension plan. Every month it comes off your check, right? Your salary. But it will be my parents that will get there'll be enough money for them. My generation and younger, there is the pension just isn't going to be there, right? It's going to run out.
So as you said, I'm in France. In France, the government has tried to change the pension age and actually Macron managed, but people are bitterly against it.
Mm-hmm. What do they want to change it to?
Well, it varies depending on what you've done, but basically it's gone up from 60 to 65 or 64. And the very popular Front National or Rassemblement pour whatever it's called, the latest manifestation of the Le Pen party, which would almost certainly win the elections at National Assembly level, the National Rally, I think they're called now. They say they're going to reverse that. Putin tried to change the pension age, and he may not have quibbled before the Ukrainian army, but he quibbled before the Russian protests. Or to put it another way, the Russians didn't turn out on the streets when their young men had been slaughtered in their tens of thousands at the battlefront. But they have turned out on the streets and changed government policy. So people feel very strongly about pensions. And pension systems will go bust. And governments will have to change them. But they're going to get enormous pushback for quite small changes. And the changes that will be required to counter this effect will be enormous. So moving the pension age a few years causes vast political anger, has huge costs in terms of political capital, and actually only buys you very little. So the answer is not, oh, well, we can just change the pension age and all will be over. But in North America, the way you run your pension system is a very physical manifestation. You can actually time when the money's going to run out. In countries like Britain, it's not so clear because we don't have a separate pot. You are charged something called national insurance, but it all goes into one pot and the pensions all come out of one pot. But the pressures are the same. And the government, I've done some work with economists on what the effect of this aging is going to be on our government in the UK. And we've come out with a title for our paper, Small Government or Small State. You can't have both. So those of us who are of the Thatcher Reagan era, who like the idea of low taxes, low spend, it ain't going to happen with the kind of sick demography that we've got, where more and more people are dependent. There are fewer and fewer young people coming into the workforce.
Yeah. And, you know, truthfully, we're living longer as well, right? So when we talk about that aging population is going to live longer. They're going to require more support.
Well, first of all, I think we need to get perspective that living longer is a good thing. And if we get to the perspective where we start saying the solution is smoothing people's paths at the end of their lives, I do feel that will be a solution, a slippery slope that ends up being worse than the problem. But in the United States and the United Kingdom, the extension of life expectancy has actually halted. We have all these diseases of modernity. I know in the States there's a big issue with opioids and so on. I mean, this is a separate subject. From a purely demographic point of view, the longer we live, the bigger this problem. But I don't want to be saying it's good if people die young. I think we should be encouraging the kind of healthcare, the kind of health during one's life, the exercise, the healthy living, to live longer. We just need to have more children so that we can support the older people. I think the worst solution to not enough kids is to start bumping off the elderly or to avoid measures that allow them to live longer, healthier lives.
This sounds like the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Well, that's a very fashionable thing. I mean, I understand young men these days are very interested in Rome. And there's been a lot of talk about demography and the collapse of Rome. I'm not an expert on the demography of the classical era. There's a lot of talk about Romans not having enough kids. I'm very dubious. The demographic data back then is not very good. And the number of Romans who would actually have been in a position to control their fertility was very low. It may have been some wealthy Romans from very top-end families were going through something like incel, or goodness knows what the world was like back then, not marrying, not having children. But I don't believe that went very low down the pecking order in ancient Rome. I think that the vast majority of Romans, or people in the Roman Empire, were probably engaging in normal sexual activity and not able to control their fertility. So it may have been they were wiped out by plagues and so on, but I don't believe they weren't having enough children on the whole. I think you need to look elsewhere for the decline of Rome. I think we are all a bit obsessed by the decline of Rome, but my guess is that it wasn't really to do with too few children, at least below the top 1%.
You know, there's a little bit of like in social media, sort of media in general, I should say, messaging around the world is overpopulated, right? You got people like Gates and WEF, Charles Schwab, who are preaching this message on how, like, if we don't get our population under control, there's not enough resources. I mean, everything you're talking about is argumentative to that position, right? Which is it's the opposite. We need more people in this world.
Well, they say generals always fight the last war. And I think people who have that perspective have their minds stuck in the 1970s. In the 1970s, as I was saying, you had a real fall in the mortality rates in many poor parts of the world. People were still having big families. And so the world's population was growing 2% a year, and some countries 3 or even 4% a year, which is phenomenal. That's over. And they need to wake up to it. And every year, the growth rate of the world's population slows. Country after country is moving into this too low fertility space. There are still places where fertility is too high in much of sub-Saharan Africa, but not all of it. Some countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, they're really getting it under control. Countries like Nigeria and Congo, they're not. So there are still places where it's too high and where it needs to be controlled. But in much of the world, it's too low. And that part of the world where it's too low is growing. Now, there is one response to that is to say, hurrah, hurrah, let's just move people from places where the fertility rate's too high to places where it's too low. Now, that is going to happen, inevitably. But when I was in Korea and they were worrying about their fertility rate, it wasn't for me to say to them, Korean culture is of no value. Korean traditions are of no value. Don't worry. Just bring people in from Gabon or Burundi, because humans are humans and they're people and they can do whatever you want Koreans to do. First of all, it's not for me to be preaching that to other cultures. Secondly, I don't believe it. I don't think the value of one human is higher than another. But we do have different values, different cultures and different traditions. And it's perfectly right and normal for people from whatever traditions and cultures to wish to see those perpetuate themselves. If they understand that for them to perpetuate themselves, they need to be having kids. And finally, the places, as I think I've already said, where fertility remains high are now countries of very, very low levels of human development. So if we're going to ship in people from the countries where fertility rates are above 4, say, today, we're going to have to spend a huge amount on training and educating them rather late in life. It's much more effective to have our own children and not to be relying on other people to do our breeding for us.
So what's the answer to this? I mean, how many kids, in quotations, do people need to start having?
Well, first of all, replacement level is 2 to 3, a little over 2. If kids are going to make it, as the vast majority, thank goodness, now do in the vast majority of the world, through their fertile years, then a couple of kids is enough. 2 to 3. There'll be people who won't want any. So, I mean, for me, 3 was a great number and it's worked, but I'm not going to tell everyone they have to be the same as me. But on average, 2, 3 or 4 is what we need, a little over 2 on average. The question then is, how do we get there? And I think there's a real limit to what government can do. So again, I'm perhaps a child of my generation, of the Thatcher-Reagan years. Reagan famously said, I'm trying to think what his phrase was about government, don't just do something, stand there or something. In other words, we need to get out of the mentality that government has all the answers. And I think that we've slipped, we've forgotten that. I think that's very true. There are things government can do, but I think throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. We need a cultural change. We need a shift so that whatever the cost of housing, whatever the cost of childcare, whatever the government support levels, at any given level, people want more children than they're having. And that's got to be about cultural norms. It's got to be about people helping their kids when their kids have kids, being active grandparents. It's got to be about products designed for larger families, making space for families on the underground or the public transport. It's got to be about models of people who are successful and use their success not to just lead a hedonistic life, but to have a family. So in the UK, for example, I talk in the book about two models of what I consider young men, although, as people pointed out, they're not young men anymore, but they're younger than me. The Prince of Wales, Prince William, who's got 3 children, David Beckham. I'm not interested in football or soccer, but a lot of people are. He's had 4. These are young men who were iconic in their time, both obviously highly, certainly called Beckham, successful. Prince William born at the top of the hierarchy, and yet they chose to devote themselves to family life. And I think that's a wonderful model. And I think the more and more people who do that, the better. So I don't think I've got all the answers, but I do think it's not just about a big government scheme. I do think there's a role for government. We should make housing more affordable for families, particularly in the UK. I think it's a big issue. We can help. And one of the things I've written about is a tax system that gives lower taxes to people who have families, which will mean higher taxes for people without families. I don't have a problem with that. Lots of countries do it. When I wrote an article along those lines, there was some consternation, but that to me seems a very reasonable thing to do. So there's a whole suite of things governments can do. But I think what's really going to shift the dial is not a government policy, but there's a change of culture, a change of heart. And the people of our countries looking at their culture, at their values, at their traditions, and saying, actually, keeping this going is something I want to do. I hope they want to have kids for their own sake. I hope others like me will persuade them that it's just the most wonderful and exciting thing you can do. And then having grandkids is fantastic. We can all preach that. But people have got to look into their hearts, into their souls, and say, is this something that I want to do? And if it is, for whether it's purely personal or national or ethnic reasons, religious reasons, whatever your reasons, to get on and do it and find a way to make it work financially, economically, and emotionally.
A very good friend of mine. In fact, I'll give him a shout out. His name is Aaron. I should be wearing one of his branded shirts. That's all I'm out wearing on one of these shows. It would have been perfect for today. Many years ago, and he's got 4 kids. I said, Aaron, man, I don't know if I want to have kids because I don't know if I could afford them. And he said, I'll give you the same advice my father gave me, which was, you'll never go broke from having kids. You'll always figure it out.
That's very wise.
Right. It is.
And one of the things I would say is that as we get richer as societies, we find it harder and harder to afford children. So I said there was a breakdown of, used to be the case, poor countries had big families and rich countries had small ones. That's kind of broken down as poorer countries have started to have small families. But where you find big families globally, nationally, it's the poorest countries. And if we look to our past, we were much poorer and we had much bigger families. So it cannot be the case that as we get richer, we can't afford kids. It just doesn't make sense. Historically and geographically, the richer societies are, the fewer kids they have. And that's about values and priorities. It's not actually about absolute constraints.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about, people have a choice to live a hedonistic lifestyle right now, right? Which is, I could be, in quotation, single forever, doing my own thing. It's a little more selfish. And I think the other side of this is there's been an attack against man, attack against the male, right? What that traditional male was, which could be the father, which is a big piece of this definition, has been attacked. And, I was chatting with a guy I work with, and he was telling me about his 17, 18-year-old son, right? And how just uninterested he is in females. Like, just not interested in dating, not interested in, in quotations, fooling around, happy just sitting at home doing his own thing. And I think this is, as we've been talking about, this is part of the major problem in what's going to happen in the world. I didn't realize until today's conversation what an issue this is on not having kids, but it makes perfect mathematical sense, right? If we're not having more kids to replace us, right? Eventually we get to this sort of tipping point where there's human collapse.
I think your point on masculinity is an interesting one, and I'm very sympathetic to it. And yet again, if you look at it, there are exceptions. So I don't think masculinity has been attacked in the same way in East Asia. I think in many ways they're quite patriarchal societies. And yet there too, people aren't having children. So in America and in the UK, that's an angle you can take. Although it's true in Japan that this tendency of young men to retreat to their bedrooms and their computers. I first heard about this about 15 years ago. There's a phenomenon in Japan called herbivores. And I think maybe it's something like incels, young men retreating into themselves. So although you can't blame feminism in Japan, for example, because there isn't much feminism. And yet, even in Japan, this seems to be a phenomenon. And one of the arguments I make in the book is I don't want to get on some traditionalist high horse and say, everyone's got to get married, everyone's got to be trad lifestyle, everyone's got to do what I did. I want women to have all the opportunities that my daughters have had. And I want them, like my daughters, to get excellent educations, get married and have their first children before they're 30. I think these things are reconcilable. I don't think we need to go back to the 1950s. I want to go forward to the late 2020s. But for the late 2020s to be a period when people form good relationships, get out of the bedroom, out of the computer, socialize, have sexual lives, have married lives, however they want to pursue it, but value children, want to have children. And at the same time, we're moving forward in all sorts of other ways, including women having opportunities in the workplace. So that means, for example, government legislation may be required to make it easier for women to combine working and childcare. In the UK, for example, something that didn't exist when I was a new father is that dads can take paternity leave. That's a very good thing. So when one of my daughters got a year off, two-thirds went to her and one-third to us. Things like that. We've got to think creatively about how we can live in today's world and have more kids. And just preaching a trad message, sympathetic or not as I may be to many of those values, I don't think is going to move us forward to a pronatal future.
You mentioned before 30 was there something to that, which is like, that is the ideal time to have kids?
Well,
or you were just saying like, hey, before 30, it's like, you know.
Well, it's an interesting point. One of the things government can do, by the way, is educate people on the fall off in their fertility rates. And from 30, your fertility rate as a woman falls off quite strongly. I mean, talking about biological fertility. So in the UK now, half of women don't have kids by the time they're 30. I think having an objective to be a parent before you're 30 is a good thing. It's not like there's a sudden cutoff, but at least get one in before you even start to go on a meaningful, serious material decline in your fertility as a woman. And as we move into a world where when my parents were dating and getting married, you tended to have a big gap between the man and the woman. The man was, neither of my parents went to university, perfectly typical of their generation. My dad was actually 11 years older than my mum at the far end, but that was much more common. You got a living, you got a property, and you married a younger one. Today, with college, everyone going to college, and so, people are much closer in age. So what's an issue for a woman is an issue for a man. If you think as a man you can drift into your 40s and 50s and find a woman of fertile years, maybe you do, but it's less and less likely. So I think that's an objective. It's a bit of an arbitrary number, but there's no doubt as you move between 30 and 35, your fertility starts to drop off. And once you're in your late 30s, it falls quite rapidly. Now, I've got a friend who had her fourth child. It was an accident at 51 and a delightful kid, who effectively has 5 parents because
That's what
his 3 siblings.
That's what we call a Christmas evening or
his
a
3
romantic
siblings,
vacation.
his 3 siblings and his parents were all his parents, really. And he's a wonderful little boy. And I've got another friend, Singaporean, actually quite typical for Singaporeans, had her only two, in her early 40s. And it happens, and it's wonderful. But to think that those exceptions are going to be the rule, to rely on technology, which is well less than 100% reliable, is probably going to deliver collectively. You may be lucky, but if we're all doing that, the collective outcome is going to be suboptimal. So to have the goal of saying, by the time I'm 30, I would like to be in the kind of stable and permanent relationship in which I could have children, and to have had my first child, doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Seems to me, again, I look at my daughters. They both went to excellent universities, got excellent degrees, kicked off their careers, had maternity leaves. They're both back at work. One of them's expecting her second, who she'll have before she's 30. That's not like some super trad lifestyle. They're not living out in the boonies, cooking in the kitchen, and they're modern, educated women making a contribution to the world, but combining it with help from us, with sensible and cooperative husbands, etc., etc. It's doable. And if people actually were more conscious of it and aimed at it and planned their lives accordingly, I think it's probably achievable for most people. And I don't think it's unreasonable that as a society, we could get our fertility rate up to 2.5, say. Shouldn't be impossible.
Right. Man, super, super interesting. Just for the audience, you've written a few books, and, if people wanted to learn more about you and get in touch with you, where could they find out more information? Tell us a little bit about the books, and then also, when is No One Left coming out? It's coming out actually July 24th. Oh no, July 24th. So July the 4th,
which I know is
next week.
A major day for you. And we're actually having an election in Britain on the 4th, it turns out. Where you can find me, if you put my name into any search engine, Paul Morland, Morland, you'll find my website. On my website, there are links to all my podcasts, my TED Talk, my articles, and my books. And in terms of my books, and if you put me into YouTube, you'll find loads of stuff. More than you'll want, I'm sure. So I've written 4 books. The first one was my doctoral thesis, which was published. And that's about how groups in ethnic conflict use demography as part of their strategy to strengthen their side in any demographic competition, effectively. And I looked at various cases. I looked at Sri Lanka, Israel, Northern Ireland, and in fact the United States. So there's a very interesting story there in the US. When states were incorporated after the 1848 war, only when they had what was considered the right sort of ethnic composition, immigration policies in the 20s, the Back to Africa movement. There's a whole story of the US that can be told from the perspective of what I call demographic engineering. So that was book 1. Book 2, The Human Tide, tells the story of the last 200 years of the world from the perspective of demography. So that transition happened, as I said, first in the States and Britain, falling mortality, booming population, and then falling fertility rates. Started in the Anglo world, went European, went global, and then population started to fall, where it happened, why it happened, and how it affected the great wars, the great economic booms and busts. Again, you can actually tell the story of the world the last 200 years much better if you have a grasp of the demography. So that was book 2. Book 3, which came out a couple of years ago, said, where are we today? It was like a balance sheet of today's world. Where is population growing? Where is infant mortality rate falling? Where is aging? Where is ethnic change happening? So it was a kind of global survey, and that's called Tomorrow's People. And the new book, No One Left, which, as I said, is out on the 4th of July, is a survey along the lines we talked about. So first of all, it says we have a problem. It looks at the problem itself, this problem of falling fertility rates, why it's happening, where it's happening. And then it looks at a couple of answers, ripostes. What about the environment? What about feminism? What about immigration? I also look at that about technology and whether technology could be the solution, something we haven't talked about, but I'm very skeptical that we can technologize our way out of this. And then I look at what we can actually do about it. And I talk about the things we talked about, what government can do, that what government can do is quite limited. And the final chapter is what we can do ourselves. It's kind of appeal over the head of government to the reader to say, go on this incredibly exciting journey, take the risk, plunge in, and you'll be doing yourself an immense favor. And you'll also be doing an immense favor to the future of the human race.
Sounds like we need another boomer generation, right?
Well, you need another baby boom. I'm not sure I'd wish the boomers with all their foibles and characteristics on you. I should say that I was born on the 15th of November, 1964. Now, by the British calculation, which is slightly different, that makes me a boomer by 6 weeks. I've heard in the US they end it in 1963. Whatever reason, I'm a late boomer. If we have another baby boom generation, I hope they are a baby boom generation, which in turn creates its own baby boom and doesn't do what my generation did, which is have families too small and find themselves too busy pursuing their own projects.
So to the audience, you heard it here, which is the answer is to increase population in this world, not decrease it. So go out and do your part. Have some babies. All right, Paul, thank you, man. This has been really, really, really interesting and super insightful. At the end of the episode, we come to the better human question, which is, what do you think we could all do to be better humans tomorrow?
Be more humans.
Love that.
So I'm very careful on issues of quality and I focus on issues of quantity. I'm not going to say what is a good human or what is a bad human. I'm not going to say that some groups are more worthy than others. I'm simply going to say, if we don't have enough of us, however fine we are, however noble we are, however educated we are, however cultured we are, all the things I might value, it's all in vain if we die out as a species. Better and better, but fewer and fewer is no good. So let me be the preacher of more, and others can be the preachers of better.
That's awesome. That's awesome. To the audience, we're going to have all of Paul's links in the show notes. Marketing your calendars, July 4th. If you listen to the episode before or after, go and pick up his book, No One Left, and do your part. Stay happy, stay healthy. We'll see you next week.